two cops chuckled as they cuffed a black man. For no reason. That is, until they stepped into court and realized he was the judge about to decide their fate. The road stretched out, nearly deserted. Just a few distant headlights slicing through the darkness. Nathan was heading home after a long day. His suit jacket lay on the passenger seat, untouched. He had driven this route 100 times before. Tonight should have been no different. But the sudden burst, red and blue flashing in his rearview mirror, told him otherwise. He exhaled, steady, eased his car to the side of the road, kept his hands visible on the wheel. He knew the drill. Footsteps crunched against the gravel behind him. A flashlight beam pierced through the driver's window, blinding him for a second. License and registration, the officer barked. The second one stood slightly behind, his hand resting on his holster. Nathan moved slowly, reaching for his wallet. "Can I ask why I was pulled over?" The officer ignored him, sweeping his light around the car's interior. "You live around here?" Nathan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "Yes, sir. Just heading home from work." The officer scoffed. "Where do you work?" "I'm a judge." The words settled in the air. The second officer smirked, stepping closer. "A judge? You got ID to prove that?" Nathan handed over his license and work credentials. The first officer took them, barely glanced at them, then shoved them back. "Step out of the car." Nathan hesitated. "Did I do something wrong?"
"Step out."
A muscle in his jaw twitched, but he knew better than to argue. He unbuckled, keeping his hands where they could see them. The first officer moved behind him. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Before he could fully process it, cold steel snapped around his wrists. "What's the charge?" he asked, voice calm. "Resisting arrest," the officer said flatly. Nathan inhaled slowly. He wasn't resisting, hadn't done anything, but he could feel the weight of the moment, pressing down heavy. The second officer snatched his wallet from the roof of the car, flipped through it, shaking his head. "This guy's full of it," he muttered. "Judge, my ass." Nathan stayed silent. He knew exactly what was happening. And he knew one thing for sure. They had no idea who they had just cuffed. But they were about to find out. The cuffs sat cold and unyielding against his skin, the weight of them heavier than it should have been. His fingers flexed, instinctively testing their limits. He had held cuffs before. In court. On the wrists of others. Men and women whose fate he had to decide. But, tonight, they were his burden to bear. The first officer gave them a rough tug, the metal biting into his skin. Nathan took a steady breath. Adrenaline simmered beneath the surface. But he refused to show it. The second officer stepped closer, smug. "You think you're special?" Venom laced his words. "You thought that little judge act would get you out of this?" Nathan met his gaze, unshaken. "I told you the truth." The first officer chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, well, here's another truth." His voice dropped lower. "You don't give orders out here." "We do." A rough hand pushed against his shoulder, forcing him forward. The gravel crunched beneath his feet as they led him to the squad car. Each step felt surreal, like he was watching someone else live this moment. For years, he had upheld the law, believed in it, trusted in its power to bring justice. But tonight, it was swallowing him whole. Face down, Nathan hesitated. Just for a second. He knew how this played out. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and things could turn from bad to worse. In an instant, slowly, he leaned forward, resting his forehead against the cool surface of the car. As they patted him down, "Wallet. Phone. What's this?" The second officer yanked out his ID, fingers flipping through it. Then, a scoff. "Judge Nathaniel Carter," he read aloud, dripping with sarcasm. "Would you look at that?" The first officer peered over his shoulder, snatching the ID away. "I'll be damned. He actually is a judge." For a beat. Silence. Nathan could almost hear the gears turning in their heads, trying to figure out how to play this off, how to salvage what was unraveling. It didn't take long. The first officer shoved the ID back into his wallet, like it didn't mean a thing. Doesn't change a damn thing, he muttered. Take him in? Nathan lifted his head slightly. For what? The officer snapped his fingers at his partner, who had already started jotting something down. Obstruction. Resisting. Suspicious activity. A pause. We'll figure it out. Nathan exhaled through his nose.
Slow. Controlled.
He had seen this before. He had ruled on cases exactly like this. Thin charges, meant to justify an arrest. Excuses that would crumble under scrutiny in a courtroom. But right now, none of that mattered, because they had already decided.
He was guilty.
The squad car door swung open, and the first officer shoved him inside. The plastic seat was hard, unforgiving, the air thick with sweat and stale cigarette smoke. Nathan leaned back, stared through the barred partitions separating him. From the front of the car, through the windshield, he saw the second officer still smirking, leaning against the hood, radio in hand. They thought they had won. Thought they had put another one in his place. Nathan stayed silent,
His pulse steady.
They had no idea what was coming. The station was colder than it should have been. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly glow. Nathan sat on a hard bench in the holding cell, hands resting on his knees. The faint indent of the cuffs still marked his wrists, a dull, aching reminder of the night's absurdity. He watched as an officer at the desk processed his paperwork, pausing now and then to glance at him. Some looked curious,
Some amused.
some indifferent. No one saw him as a man. Just another black face in a cell. Just another body passing through the system. Nathan tapped his gavel lightly. This hearing is concluded. Briggs shut up from his seat, his face red with frustration.
But there was nothing left.
To argue, nothing left to fight. Nathan stood gathering his papers. As he turned to leave, he paused just for a moment, glancing back at them one last time. I told you the truth that night, he said simply. You just didn't want to believe it. Then he walked out, leaving them to sit with the consequences of their actions, and for the first time, they finally understood what accountability felt like. Nathan stepped out of the courtroom and into the hallway, his breathing steady, his mind clear. The moment he had been waiting for, not revenge, but justice, had finally arrived. Yet, as much as the officers had deserved every consequence coming their way, he felt no satisfaction in their downfall, because this wasn't just about two cops. It wasn't just about one bad night.
It was about a system.
One that allowed men like Briggs and Mercer to operate unchecked for years. A system where the burden of proof always seemed heavier for people who looked like him. He walked past the rows of reporters, waiting outside the courtroom doors. Questions flew at him. Judge Carter, do you have a comment? Do you believe justice was served? What do you say to those who think this was personal? He stopped, turned to the cameras, and spoke calmly. Clearly, this was never about personal revenge.
It was about accountability.
No one should fear those who are sworn to protect them. And no one, not even those in uniform, is above the law. The reporters scrambled for more. But he was done talking. He had said what mattered. Nathan walked down the courthouse steps, the weight of the night 2 weeks ago finally lifting. He wasn't naive enough to believe that one hearing would change everything.
But it was a start, and sometimes
a start is enough to make people pay attention. If we allow abuse of power to go unchecked,
we
become complicit in the system that allows it to exist. The fight for justice is not about revenge. It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through what so many have already endured. Nathan stepped into his car, adjusting the rearview mirror, before pulling away from the courthouse.
Somewhere out there,
another black man would be pulled over tonight. But maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. If you believe in justice, if you believe in accountability, share this story. Let's make sure it reaches the people who need to hear it most.